Hello and welcome back to another video. This is Web Union and I'll be doing an in-depth analysis of the whole front line from the Zaporizhzhia front to the Liman area. So starting out in the south where the Ukrainians have launched their offensive, here we have a different perspective than the rest of the front line. So we'll have to add this to the southern front, which goes from Velika Novosilka to Remevsky Lech area and all the way down to Kamyansky here in the west. And then what we actually see is that the Ukrainian forces here, anything south of Novodanilivka, the fields of the north of Robotyne, and Robotyne itself is hardly any defenses in this area. It's very easy for Russians to just counterattack and regain positions that the Ukrainians have captured because there's not really any sort of fortifications in the area that the Ukrainians have other than the ones that have occupied by the Russian forces. And the Russian forces have those mapped out. It's difficult for the Ukrainians to build new ones due to the weather conditions. Therefore, what we see is that the Ukrainian forces are in a very vulnerable position here south of Novodanilivka. As for the Remevsky Lech area and the area here between Velika Novosilka and Uledar, this is a different area than the central ports here by Zaporizhzhia, Oryhiv, and so on. So starting out in this area, we can see that there's a lot of road connections, highways, and so on that goes in between the areas by the front line, where we have the three areas that are important for the connections between these highways. We have Tokmak, we have Oryhiv, and we have Huliaipole. So these three will be the targets for any possible Russian offensive in the area, would be Oryhiv and Huliaipole. The reason for this is that they connect the eastern parts with the western parts. Oryhiv is the central part, the most important one. Huliaipole is also important because it ends the rail connection here to the east. It also has the connections with the highways here in the east. So with this we see, okay, any attempt of the Russian forces in the Zaporizhzhia front will focus around Oryhiv and Huliaipole. We also have the Kamyansky area, and this is an important village because it is split in two, and the reason for that is that we have this river line that goes through the central parts all the way down to Lobkove. So with the Ukrainian forces holding these positions here to the west of Lobkove, this is also vulnerable positions because they captured it from the Russian forces, leaving them with the only fortifications available, the ones the Russians had. And other than that, there is the river line to the back of them, so they are very vulnerable in this position. The Russians can attack from Serbianki and upwards, and then suddenly the Ukrainian forces here are cut off. They have to cross the river, or they'll have to fight through to Lobkove. So anyways, in any regards, it's difficult for the Russian forces to cross the river line here. So what we'll likely see is an operation to take these 5 villages, similar to what we saw prior to the Ukrainian offensive. So what we'll see is that the Russian forces will try to move along the roads, the highway, or they will move through the fields. The fields are likely heavily mined, similar to how the Ukrainians had to go through heavy minefields to go south. The Russians would have to go through heavy minefields to go north. So you'll likely see some sort of anti-mining operation by the Russian forces, but more on that in my in-depth analysis. The general assumption here is that the Ukrainians have fortifications along the highway and minefields beneath it. There's the river line here, so this is the sort of defensive line west of Oryhiv. Oryhiv itself has a set of fortifications, heavy fortifications connected with Novodanilivka, Malotokmachka, and so on. And then we have this road here. This area here between Oryhiv and Huliaipole is a large field with a lot of mines here as well. Any large field area will have a lot of mines. That is the nature of this type of warfare. And then we have this village chain along the highway, which will likely be the Ukrainian army positions. So anywhere between Huliaipole and Oryhiv will be heavily fortified and large minefields beneath them. So anywhere the Russian forces will have to try to advance in this direction will be similar to the Ukrainian offensive, where they have to go through large minefields before reaching heavily fortified areas. However, the issue the Ukrainians are facing is that they only have one line of defense, really. They have the heavy fortifications by Oryhiv itself, and then the connection between Huliaipole all the way down to Kamyansky. This is all one defensive line. And beyond this, there's not really any fortifications of any sort. It's likely going to be minefields and so on, but not really any sort of severe level of fortification. So if the Russian forces break through this initial line, they will essentially have a free pass all the way down to Zaporizhzhia city. So that is the weakness of the Ukrainian defenses here in the south. That is that they only have one line of defense, really. Moving on to the Remersky Lech area, this area is completely different to the Zaporizhzhia front because there's no highways here. The only one is here between Olhanke to Velika Novosilka. So this road here between Velika Novosilka and Uledar here to the south, this area here are the two most important villages in this section of the front line because they are heavily fortified and they connect with each other here to the south. The Russian forces don't really care that much about this section because in the end supplies will be very difficult to reach to this area, especially since the front line is located exactly at the middle between the two highways. With this, both sides have difficulties reaching with supplies to the front line. That was the biggest weakness of both sides during the Ukrainian offensive, is the lack of supplies. However, if the Russian forces want to advance here from the Marinka direction, they will need to capture Uledar and Velika Novosilka. This is why we have seen no great efforts by the Russian forces to actually capture Marinka, despite them achieving that. Finally, after almost 10 years of fighting in the city, the Russian forces managed to capture Marinka. However, they haven't really advanced past it, and they're still sitting there. The reason for this is if they start attacking and advance, and then manage to reach this whole area, they would have a bulge. The Ukrainian forces could counterattack from Pervomaiske, they could counterattack from Uledar, and they would be in a very vulnerable position because the Ukrainian forces could just close their flanks. So instead, what the Russian forces would need to do is that they would need to launch an assault on Uledar, take control of it, move towards Velika Novosilka, take control of it, and at that point, if they launch offensive operations here by Marinka towards the west, they'll have a secure flank in the south, and they wouldn't need to worry about the situation with the supplies because they would have the highway here between the south of Donetsk towards Velika Novosilka, and they will also have the highway from Donetsk through Marinka. So they will have two supply lines that are connected here by Velika Novosilka. So a prerequisite for the Russian forces to launch offensive operations here to the south of Donetsk is them capturing Uledar and Velika Novosilka. This is why they launched operations towards Uledar. It's not because that it is a heavily fortified area that they just need to go around. They can't due to the lack of supplies in the area. The objective should be to capture Uledar, but how can they do so? The most logical answer is, based on what we have seen how the Russians fight, is that they will completely continue bombardments of the city until nothing remains, after which they will just storm the ruins, similar to what they've done in Marinka. So with that, we will likely see much more attempts by the Russian forces to just completely bombard Uledar, especially with the new bombs, the FAB 1500, that will allow them to hit more of these fortified buildings that have been difficult for them to break through since the start. The difference between Marinka and Uledar is Marinka is much larger, but the fortifications there are much more spread out. As such, Uledar is much smaller, and as such, the fortifications are very heavy, and the buildings would be very difficult to blow up with, for example, the FAB 500s, which have completely demolished Marinka, but Uledar has sustained these attacks. But with the FAB 1500, the FAB 2500, and the FAB 5000, once they come out, they'll be able to completely level Uledar to the ground, and that is likely what we will see once the Russian forces finish researching it. That is the advantages of having a significant air defense as the Ukrainians have. The level of air defense systems is enough for them to hold back the Russian air force from reaching within like 50 kilometers of the front line. So they launch these FAB bombs that are glide bombs. They launch them from within Russian territory. They fly 50, 100 kilometers before reaching the front line and hitting their positions. They are accurate, however, the Ukrainian Air Force can also shoot them down. The Ukrainian Air Defense Forces can shoot them down, so they aren't really reliable. This is why the difficulty isn't just producing these 2500 and 5000 FAB bombs. The difficulty is also having them actually land onto their locations. But of course, we've seen them do it because the Ukrainians are running low on air defense systems because Western aid is slowing down. But it has been a focus of Western countries to send more and more air defense systems since the Ukrainian forces started running low on the S-300 system. As for the Donetsk region itself, we see that the main focus is Marinka and Avdiivka. The reason for this is two-pronged. The first one is Avdiivka itself is a heavily fortified area that is just, some even consider it a suburb to Donetsk itself. So the Russian forces have a really symbolic objective with capturing Avdiivka. It's also a city that the DPR managed to capture during the Civil War, but then the Ukrainian forces recaptured it. It is one that has had heavy fighting throughout the years. We can even see it with these satellite images. There are holes everywhere from all of the artillery that has been launched in this direction. There are fortifications and trenches all throughout the area. So generally, this whole area is, well, clearly a very important part. It also gives the Ukrainians the advantage and ability to launch artillery strikes into Donetsk. So there's so many things the Ukrainians have as advantages and so many issues the Russians have with the Ukrainians holding this area that it is a clear target. However, it is also the most fortified city in all of Ukraine, and as such it is difficult to take control of, but we're seeing the heavy Russian pressure over the area. So we'll likely see that the current offensive that the Russians have launched will continue until they manage to fully control Avdiivka. And as I've mentioned in my updates, in my daily updates, the Russian forces are heavily fighting in the northern and southern flanks. They're trying to storm the southeast of the city, and they're trying to gain control over the coke plant here to the north and the supply lines here to the south to completely cut off Avdiivka from supplies and then storm it, similar to the tactics around Bakhmut. So if you want to understand what the fighting in Avdiivka is going to entail, watch my old videos where I cover Bakhmut in detail and you'll figure that out. We then move on to the Orivka area, which is the city north of Donetsk. We have seen some fighting here by the line, which was the ceasefire line of 2014. However, I would not put much thought into this area. It is very unlikely that it will bring anything with it. It is likely just the Ukrainian forces trying to divert some of the Russian personnel and supplies to this area rather than having them by Avdiivka and Bakhmut. And talking about Bakhmut, let's take a look at that, as it has been one of the focuses of the Russian forces here lately. So we have the southern flank, the northern flank, and the western operation and the northern operation of Bakhmut. We can combine Bakhmut and Siversk as one front. The reason for this is that we have the same units fighting in this whole area. This is one army group. And this army group is a combination of Russian forces, DPR forces, LPR forces, and Wagner forces, former Wagner forces. The main source of units is VDV units, as the main force of units fighting in this direction is infantry-based units. The reason for this is the heavy urban areas here in this direction, forest lines, and urban areas in general, the industrial areas and so on, that requires infantry-based assaults. Russian VDV units are heavily infantry-based, but they also have a lot of armor, they have a lot of artillery, and they also have a lot of artillery units. So the way the Russian forces are fighting in this direction is heavily bombarding areas, then storming it with infantry and armored vehicles as support. They also sometimes launch armored-based assaults to try and clear the way for the infantry. However, the main focus of the Russian forces here is getting to urban areas and then storming it. This is similar to what we're seeing by Klishivka. They launched armored assaults here to the north, capturing the fortified trench network to the northwest of the village, and as such they are now going to launch infantry-based assaults towards the village itself and launch further armored assaults westwards, all while heavily bombarding all of the Ukrainian positions all throughout the southern flank from Ivanivske and south. This is to try and keep the Ukrainian forces at the positions, bog them down with heavy artillery fire as they try to make their maneuvers in the north of Klishivka. This is to cut off the southern parts of the flank of Bakhmut, and as such they want to cut off Ukrainian forces. They want to recapture all of the Ukrainian gains all throughout their offensive, as well as try to gain favorable positions ahead of a future assault across the canal line. But what their focus is right now is clearly to get a front line by the canal to try and get a favorable flank in this direction. The reason for this is that the Russian forces will likely look to gain control over the Siversk area, and to launch attacks towards the Siversk area they would be vulnerable to Ukrainian attacks on the flank here to the west of Bakhmut. To avoid that, they will need to set up a front line by the canal that goes through here to the west of Ivanivske, west of Bakhmut, and then launch assaults towards Siversk. This is to make sure that they have a secure flank before launching their attack to prevent any Ukrainian counterattacks being successful in this direction. So they want to focus a lot of forces in this assault, and as such they need to have a secure flank by Bakhmut. So the Russian objective here is to launch attacks towards the canal line, establish a front line by it, and then launch attacks to the north towards Siversk, whether it be by capturing Vesely, Rosolivka, Fedorivka, and launching attacks through the highway to the south towards Siversk, or launching a combined assault from the east and the south, or generally just to move along the canal line and cut off the forces. Either way, their target would be Siversk and establishing a front line by the canal before launching attacks towards Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinivka, and so on. The reason for this is in connection with the northern parts. So the official goal of the Russian forces when it comes to territory is gaining control over the Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk regions. To gain full control over the Donetsk region, they need to capture main separate areas. They need to capture Liman, Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinivka, Joseph Yar, Uledar, Avdiivka, Marinka, Velikonovosilka, Pokrovsk, all of these villages and cities all across the Donetsk region. They still miss a significant part of it. Zaporizhia and Kherson are secondary. The main one is the Donetsk region. The reason for this is that the war has continued here for 10 years, and as such the others are much more recent in conflict. They need to quote-unquote end the suffering of the people of Donetsk. To gain control over Liman, the Russian forces need to launch offensive operations to do that. They can launch a straight-ahead definite assault towards Liman. However, this is a stupid idea. First off, they have to cross the Serbets River. They also have the whole southern flank, which is heavy forest areas filled with Ukrainian soldiers. And in the north, there's heavy open fields, so the Ukrainian forces can launch armored assaults to flank the Russian forces. So this is a terrible decision. So the first one is to establish a front line by the Serbets River, similar to the canal here to the south. They would need to establish this position to protect their flank. They would also need to gain full control over the forest areas here to the south of Kreminna and Liman, connecting the two cities, as that would allow them to have a secure flank to the south, prevent the Ukrainian forces from launching attacks towards the supply lines of the Russian forces, taking cover in the forest to establish guerrilla fighting positions. And then finally, they'd need to gain control over the northern parts to avoid a Ukrainian counterattack from the north. That is why we're seeing operations in the direction of Kupiansk, as Kupiansk is one of the main supply areas for the Ukrainian forces across the Oskar River line. So the Russian forces will look to gain three different objectives. The first one being here to the north of Kupiansk, where they want to either cut off Kupiansk or gain control over the village. As such, they would cut off one of the main supply lines of the Ukrainian forces in the north. They would then look to move southwards and cut off the Ukrainian supplies across the main bridge here in the central parts, and gaining control over the northern parts, gaining full control between the highway from Kupiansk to Svatove. As such, they would secure the village of Svatove, which is one of the main supply hubs for the Russian forces in this section of the front line. After which they would also look to gain control over the Serbets River simultaneously with the attacks in the north, which would then allow them to have a strong flank here to the south. And with that, they would have control over everything except for the fields here to the north of Liman and the forest lines here to the south of Liman and Liman itself. As such, they would launch a combined assault with infantry-based assaults through the forest lines, armored assaults from the north towards Liman, flanking the Ukrainian positions, and attack straight ahead through the Serbets River, establishing bridgeheads across the river line, and as such they would be able to launch attacks towards Liman, gain control of it, establish a front line by the Oskar River line, and hold the territories of the Donetsk region here to the north, and gain full control over the Luhansk region. As such, they would be able to then focus their attention on Slovyansk, Konstantinivka, Kramatorsk line, which is the main defensive line of Ukrainian forces in the Donetsk region. This is the largest civilian hub of population and industry and so on in the Donetsk region, besides what Russian forces already control. Then they would have their focus in coordination with the southern parts. But until then, the southern parts is secondary and the northern parts is the main focus. The reason for that is if the Russian forces have a front line by the Slovyansk Konstantinivka area, then they would have a secure line by the canal, and as such the Ukrainian forces would be unable to make use of the large concentration of both supplies, personnel, ammunition, and whatever else they have in this area, which is well connected with the highways. As such, the Russian forces can divert the resources to the north and to the south in the direction of Donetsk, and at the same time they'll be able to pressure the whole area here, hitting them with artillery, hitting them with long-range assaults, airstrikes, everything else you need to attrit the Ukrainian forces in their supply hubs. And then we'll also likely see Russian assaults west of Avdiivka, west of Marinka, taking control of Uledar, Velik, and Vasilka, and launching attacks towards Pokrovsk, which is the main supply connection area, similar to that of Orikhiv, but in the whole Donetsk region. If Pokrovsk is cut off, the only supply would be coming from the north from Kharkiv, and if the Russian forces have control over Liman, then the only supply of highway/railway would be nothing. There would be nothing between Pokrovsk and Liman, and as such, they would have to use trucks through these minor roads all the way to the Donetsk region, and it would significantly complicate the supply situation of the Ukrainian forces in the Donbass region. And as such, I'll end off this analysis here. I'll be doing in-depth analysis on my Patreon later on. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.